Imagine an empire so absolutely colossal that it literally spanned across 11 separate time zones. We're talking about a geopolitical titan covering almost one-sixth of the entire Earth's landmass. It stretched all the way from the edge of Eastern Europe, straight across the freezing, unforgiving expanse of Siberia, right to the Pacific Ocean. So let's dive into this explainer. We're going to explore exactly how this enormous empire was built over 170 years, transforming from relatively humble beginnings into an absolute global powerhouse. For more than a century and a half, the Russian Empire fought massive wars, built these incredible cities, and became one of the world's most formidable powers. But its end was just as dramatic as its rise. So we've got a central mystery to solve today. How did a nation achieve such unprecedented absolute power? And why on earth did it collapse so suddenly and so violently? We're going to unpack the incredible dramatic momentum of this massive empire to understand exactly what caused it to ultimately shatter. To do that, here is our roadmap. We'll start with the birth of the empire, then look at expanding across two continents, deal with the weight of inequality, move into triumphs and rising tensions, and finally, the collapse and lasting legacy. Alright, let's kick things off with part 1, Birth of the Empire. Everything really kicks into high gear with one specifically driven guy, Peter the Great. In just a matter of decades, he fundamentally altered the country's trajectory through these sweeping military and technological reforms. In 1703, he founded St. Petersburg, and get this, he didn't just find a nice spot, he literally built a brand new imperial capital in a freezing, miserable swamp using forced labor. Why? Because he was absolutely obsessed with having a western-facing port on the Baltic Sea. By 1721, the Russian Empire was officially established. Peter wanted Russia to be a major European player, and he knew that a modernized navy and army were the keys to unlocking that door. So, how did he actually pull this off? Well, by defeating Sweden in the grueling Great Northern War, Russia secured that vital maritime access. They proved they were no longer just some peripheral state, they were a dominant force in Northern Europe. But beyond the battlefield, Peter enacted massive internal changes. He pushed through sweeping government, tax, and education reforms. In fact, he was so determined to force Russian society to westernize that he instituted the infamous beard tax, literally taxing the facial hair of Russian nobles to force them to look more European. He wasn't just conquering, he was laying the complex administrative groundwork for a massive imperial machine. Which brings us to part 2, expanding across two continents. Following Peter's reign, this colossal movement began. Soldiers, merchants, and settlers relentlessly pushed eastward, eventually turning Russia into one of the largest land empires in human history. Just imagine the brutal conditions of crossing Siberia on foot or horseback. Explorers navigated thousands of miles of dense, unforgiving forests and freezing rivers. They pushed and pushed until they literally hit the Pacific Ocean. And amazingly, they didn't stop there. They crossed the water and expanded right into Alaska, setting up highly lucrative trading operations on a whole new continent. Though, surprisingly, their North American expansion ultimately ended when they sold Alaska to the United States for just 2 cents an acre. Crazy, right? But hey, expansion wasn't just happening in the freezing East. Ruling from 1762 to 1796, Catherine the Great aggressively expanded the borders into Eastern Europe. Interestingly enough, Catherine wasn't even born Russian. She was actually German. Yet she became the empire's most famous expanding monarch. She pushed the empire down to the Black Sea region, which was incredibly strategic. It secured warm water ports that don't freeze over in winter, an absolute game changer for trade and military mobility. She was a master of duality, really. She balanced a deep love for Enlightenment philosophers like Voltaire and supported education and the arts with a fierce dedication to aggressive military conquests. Now, let's look at part 3, the weight of inequality. Because beneath this glittering imperial surface, the reality for everyday people was, well, vastly different from the polished halls of those palaces. The empire possessed staggering natural resources, endless forests, rich minerals, vast agricultural land. It was unbelievably wealthy, yet a massive portion of its population was tied to estates without even basic freedoms. Millions of peasants lived under serfdom. Imagine being legally bound to a plot of land, bought and sold practically like property, despite living in a nation overflowing with natural wealth. It was a deeply unequal society where the immense riches of the elite were built entirely on the backbreaking, restrictive poverty of the masses. Then comes 1861. This is a massive turning point. Emperor Alexander II finally abolished serfdom. To put that into perspective, Russia emancipated its serfs roughly 2 years before the United States issued the Emancipation Proclamation. But while legally ending serfdom was a monumental reform on paper, severe poverty and inequality tragically remained. Why? Because the newly freed peasants were given their liberty, sure, but they were not given enough land to actually survive, let alone thrive. They were saddled with massive debts to pay for the tiny plots they did receive, quietly generating this intense social friction that would soon boil over. Moving right along to Part 4, Triumphs and Rising Tensions. Heading into the 19th and 20th centuries, the empire faced some intense external tests. One of the greatest came in 1812 against Napoleon Bonaparte's massive invading army. And what did Russia do? They used their own enormous geography and environment as a weapon. They systematically retreated, pulling the French deeper and deeper into the harsh terrain, stretching their supply lines right to the breaking point. But it wasn't just brilliant military tactics. It was the famous General Winter. The brutal, freezing temperatures did far more to destroy the French army than bullets ever did, turning a bold invasion into a complete disaster and skyrocketing Russian prestige across Europe. At the exact same time, internally, the empire was racing to modernize. In the late 19th century, construction began on the colossal Trans-Siberian Railway, an absolute engineering marvel, stretching thousands of miles to finally connect European Russia with the Pacific coast. Factories were booming in Moscow and St. Petersburg. However, you really have to contrast this technological triumph with the dark, suffocating reality of the crowded factory slums. The brutal working conditions caused political groups and intellectuals to increasingly demand reform. The workers were suffering, and the social tension was escalating to dangerous levels. The pressure cooker was whistling. Which brings us to our final act, Part 5, Collapse and Lasting Legacy. We've reached the breaking point, where all of these unresolved pressures violently explode in a series of cascading crises. First, in 1904 to 1905, the government's reputation was absolutely shattered by an unexpected, humiliating defeat in the Russo-Japanese War. This was a massive shock to the globe, an enormous European empire defeated by an emerging Asian nation. It completely shattered the myth of Russian invincibility. This led directly to mass protests in 1905, forcing the creation of a representative assembly called the Duma. But it just wasn't enough. The fatal blow came in 1914. Mobilization for World War I threw the country into a devastating meat grinder, resulting in enormous casualties and severe food shortages that completely collapsed public confidence in the imperial government. By 1917, the pressure was completely insurmountable. Mass strikes in Petrograd forced Emperor Nicholas II to abdicate. I mean, stop and think about the gravity of that moment for a second. 3 whole centuries of absolute Romanov rule vanished almost overnight. The sheer weight of the pressure snapped the monarchy in half, ending an empire that had stretched across 2 continents in the face of a revolutionary crisis. And the timeline of this collapse was incredibly rapid and incredibly bloody. It wasn't just one revolution, but 2, tearing the country apart from the inside out. February 1917 marked the fall of the monarchy to a provisional government. But that government really struggled to fix the severe wartime problems. So, the chaos quickly gave way to Lenin's Bolshevik Revolution in October 1917. This plunged the nation into a bitter, devastating civil war, ushering in an entirely new political era until the Soviet Union finally rose from the ashes in 1922. The Russian Empire had officially disappeared. But an empire of this magnitude doesn't just vanish without leaving a deep mark on the world. The legacy of the Russian Empire is massive, balancing incredible cultural milestones against a really harsh reality of conflict. On one hand, you have the production of incredibly influential art and intellect. Think of the brilliant literature of Leo Tolstoy and Fyodor Dostoevsky, the soaring music of Tchaikovsky, the groundbreaking science of Dmitry Mendeleev, who literally gave us the periodic table of elements. Yet you have to weigh all of that culture against the devastating historical costs. Centuries of absolute political repression, severe inequality, and relentless warfare across an enormous territory. As we close out this explainer, I want you to consider how the borders, cultures, and geopolitical tensions forged by this fallen giant continue to impact our modern world. The empire may have collapsed over a century ago, but when we look at the news today, we have to ask, did the geopolitical ambitions of the Russian Empire ever truly disappear? The shockwaves it created are absolutely still being felt right now. Thank you so much for joining me to unpack this monumental piece of history. Keep analyzing, keep asking questions, and I'll see you in the next explainer.